And it gives me very great pleasure to reintroduce to you Jon Cicirelli, who is going to be talking to us about contracting for success. Can you put your hands together to welcome Jon?
Thank you. I know, one of my favorite things to talk about is cats, and I love that everybody's talking about cats at this conference. I think it's great, but I am not going to talk about cats in this presentation. I'm going to talk about contracting. This actually came out of a larger discussion that I was involved in over the last few years in California. Back in the late 1990s, several laws changed in California about how long we had to house animals. If you recall from my last presentation, I was telling you that we have a law that allows nonprofit animal rescue groups to take an animal from a shelter if the shelter is going to euthanize that animal. It's an actual requirement. So there were several laws like that that all passed at the same time. And then about 10, 12 years later, well actually 13 or 14 years later, we decided to look back as a group, several of us that have expertise in the field and a bunch of colleagues. We got together and spent about a year and a half researching all the data in the state and trying to decide, well, did these laws help or hurt or do nothing? How did they work out? And one of the things we talked about in that paper was contracting services and how we found in many instances sort of when services were contracted, particularly to a nonprofit agency by government, that they weren't really well done contracts. And so we thought that was an area that deserved a little more scrutiny. And you can see that website on the bottom there. That's the paper. That paper actually covers a variety of topics. It's actually a very long paper, about 60 pages or so. But it is heavily referenced. We had several experts in the field contribute to the paper. And there are various sections, including a whole lot of stuff about cats. And a lot of the things that we've been talking about cats in this session that'll reinforce a lot of things. But the great thing about that paper is it also has all the references to the studies and the data and the statistics so that when you're trying to make arguments about various subject matter that might be in the paper, you actually have references you can point to. It doesn't sound like you're just making things up. So in San Jose, I think I talked a little bit about San Jose yesterday, but I didn't mention we also provide contracting services, so to 6 other cities that we provide services to. Now we're a government agency and we're providing services to other government agencies. And in my former position also as a director in Southern California, I also had 4 other contracts. So I've had some experience with writing contracts, negotiating contracts, and trying to make them work for us, which is not always an easy thing to do. I will, right at the beginning, I don't know if you saw on the very first page, I am not a lawyer. So, when you're looking at doing contracts, it is always a wise idea, even if you don't have a lawyer that maybe is on your board or that can help you pro bono, that you pay a lawyer to look at your contract. It's worth the few $100s. You'll probably have to pay them for a few hours of work to just look it over and make sure you're not missing something or you're not taking an unnecessary risk. In the city, we're lucky. We employ lawyers. I have a lawyer assigned to my area of operation, so I have someone that can review these things for me. And it's good because you learn a lot from them over the years as you work with them. So I think when you're doing contracts for services, and I know I've talked to several of you over the last couple days, and there are various states of contracts that some of you have. Some of you have all the services. Some of you just maybe have the shelter, and the government has the compliance officers. So there's a variety of ways in which they're done. But really, I think when you're first looking at it, you have to look at, well, what is government after? I mean, why are they contracting in the first place? And it's usually some form of legal compliance, right? There's some law that says they have to pick up dogs or have to do something. Or they're trying to be responsive to the public. So in the case, for example, of nuisances, and general problems in the neighborhood, and people are always complaining to their offices, they want someone to be able to go out and help. But the flip side of that is, what do you want out of a contract, particularly if you're a nonprofit? What do you stand to gain? And unfortunately, what we find, at least in the States with some frequency, is that what agencies are hoping to gain is money. And there's nothing wrong with getting money, but that can't be the sole basis for your decision to enter into a contract with a government agency. And I've actually seen, I do some consulting as well to agencies a few years ago, very large city in the center of California. They were taking in 55,000 animals a year, probably euthanizing 70% of them, 75% of them. All kinds of problems with the agency, but it was a humane society that was doing this. And when I was looking at their financial information, I found that out of maybe $5 million a year they spent, this is a humane society, this is a nonprofit organization, they only fundraised about $300,000 of it. And all the rest of their income came from their contracts with the government. And so what they found was they were in a really tough spot, because if they wanted to give up a contract, they were going to give up a lot of money, which would really hurt the organization in a lot of ways. They would end up having to let people go and lay them off and downsize what they were doing, which they didn't want to do. Yet they were getting really horrible results. They were getting a whole lot of criticism from the public, and they really felt trapped, just stuck in a corner, because their business model relied too heavily on getting money from the government for these contracts that weren't well done, they weren't well compensated. And so that's one of the examples that really sort of made us think about, well, what's a way we can do better? And so you really want these things to be mutually beneficial. You want them to be a partnership. You want to be able to meet your goals as well as provide what they want. And at the end, don't forget, you should be asking yourself, do you really have to do this? Because you don't. And I know sometimes that's hard, particularly folks that are already in contracts now and already rely on that money. But you don't actually have to contract with another agency. You don't have to provide those services. So bear that in mind, because sometimes you end up digging your own hole. There is no real good industry standard for contracts. They vary a great deal. Some of them are species specific. So, for example, I know some of the local councils here, they only really deal with dogs. They don't really do anything about cats. So they're only going to have a contract related to dogs. They're generally not going to pay another agency to do much about cats, probably, because that's not something they're going to pay for. And we see that in California as well. There's some agencies that say, well, you know, the only cats we really want you to pick up is if it's sick or injured or quarantined, and, you know, it's bitten somebody and needs to be quarantined. Otherwise, we don't want you just going and picking up free-roaming cats all over the place, or accepting cats. Or if you do accept them, you're doing it at your own expense. We're not going to pay you to do it. And some contracts are full service. So you can both have the shelter and be responsible for all the sheltering, and you're also responsible for all the field work, right? The investigators, the animal management officers, going out in the field and picking things up, which means you're going to have a fleet of vehicles and all the things that go with that. So they can come in a whole variety of ways, and what I'm going to talk about generally applies to all the different variations, whether it's full service or not. So the key point, I think, to begin with is when you start a negotiation, you really got to ask the agency that's asking you to provide these services for them, you really have to ask them, what do you want? I mean, what is it you're interested in getting? And that can form for you the basis of an informed decision about what you're able to provide. Because, for example, say all they really want to do is do something about dogs, and they don't really want to do something about cats, but cats are a significant issue, and your organization sees cats as a significant issue. You might want to rethink that partnership. You might want to think, well, if they're not going to invest in cats, then maybe that's not the best way to go. One of the most important things you have to know before going into negotiations is what you're getting into, right? So you need to understand the information that they might have. Now, I do know, and we've talked about it in various forums in this conference, that sometimes it's a little difficult getting the information about how many animals they're taking in or what they're doing year in and year out. I would suggest to you that if you're working with a government or a local council that can't provide you at least some basic information, you need to think seriously about that relationship, because if they're not willing to give you the information to make a quality decision up front, then how cooperative are they going to be along the way once you're fully engaged in that contract and now you're responsible for providing those services? Most importantly, and this is probably where you can gain the biggest advantage in negotiating contracts, is know the law. So before you go into these contracts, read what the local laws are. What are the requirements? What are the requirements for both people who own animals and the requirements for the agency? For example, how long do they have to hold an animal? Or what types of calls do they have to do versus what calls are optional? Understand any laws that are going to govern the things that you do in the animal shelter. I assure you that in most cases, whomever you're negotiating with in the government, in the local council, will not know these things. You know, they just want a contract, they want to pay somebody to take care of a problem, they're going to rely on you to have the expertise. Have it when you get there. Know what the law is, because you will have the advantage. You'll be able to say, well, look, you want me to do X, Y, and Z, but A, B, and C law constrains me from doing that. Or A, B, and C law says you also have to do these things over here, so you're going to have to pay me to do those things. You can't just get away with paying me for doing a few things. These are the things, all the things that you're obligated to do. And you actually can walk in more confident and more knowledgeable about what's going on than who you're negotiating with. And be willing to make yourself accountable. You know, one of the things that is pretty common in our business, particularly when it comes to advocacy or folks talk about the no-kill movement in America, is it's always pretty easy to criticize the government agency and say, well, you know, you don't put your stats up, or you get bad results, or you know, you're secretive, or you don't this, you don't that. Well, don't get up there yourself and be secretive. Be open, be accountable, set targets, set expectations. Don't repeat what they're doing. You have to show the correct example, and you have to be willing to show the government that, hey, we'll be accountable for our results. That's why we make a good partner for you, is because we're going to be accountable. We are going to be open. We are going to engage the public. We're not going to be secretive. So don't be afraid to set performance targets, and don't be afraid to get compensated for performance. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So you also don't want to gouge the government. You know, you don't want to overcharge them for something that, something that costs $100. You don't want to charge them $300 for it. It's not fair. And let's not forget, you're paying for this money to come to you because it's coming out of your pocket as a taxpayer. Ultimately, it comes back around to your organization through the government, but everybody in your community is paying for this service. That money isn't just coming from nowhere. It's coming out of your pocket, ultimately. So, be fair in your negotiations, but don't hurt yourself in the negotiation either. Don't undercut yourself just because you feel charitable. That's not what it's about. Of course, be transparent about the costs. If they want to know what the financial records are and how much you're spending on certain things, be willing to share that information. Again, being secretive is not a good thing with government, although unfortunately they do it themselves, but that doesn't give us an excuse to do it ourselves. You really want to outline roles and expectations. You want to be clear about what's our responsibility and what's not our responsibility. I'll give you a common example. So dog licensing, which I think you call dog registration. So in most areas in the states, it's required. A lot of nonprofits that take government contracts don't really like getting involved in dog licensing. It's a compliance issue, it's an enforcement issue. A lot of times nonprofits get worried about being too enforcement heavy, that it'll hurt their fundraising opportunities. It might put them in a bad light with people. Now that's not to say that some don't. Some do. Some will focus on licensing as a revenue or registration as a revenue source, but a lot of them don't because of a variety of reasons. But if you're not going to do that, you need to be clear up front. We're not going to do this. This is something that we're not willing to be involved in, and you as a government are going to have to pursue this separately. One of my colleagues that works very nearby where I live, he contracts to every single city in his county. It's like, 10, 15 different cities. He provides all the services, full services for everything, but he leaves it to the county to pursue their own licensing. And the county does a whole independent process of the shelter and the enforcement and everything else for all the other services that he's paid for, and they have to pursue their own licensing strategies. And then make sure you have an ability to adjust. There's no sense writing a 5-year, $100,000 a year contract, and it's $100,000 for every year. The cost of that service is going to change over 5 years. You have to be able to increase it. So I don't know if you use the term COLA here, but that means cost of living adjustment. So it really just looks at the price of goods and services and labor. And we have what's called a consumer price index that we typically peg to, which is done nationally. It's done by the federal government. They just look at the various areas of the country and say, well, here's what the cost of general goods and services have gone up. It's gone up 2.5%. And so if you do things like tie your contract into those kind of indexes, then you'll be assured that as the economy changes and as prices go up, you will be paid correctly. Otherwise, 5 years down the road, you're going to find yourself pretty far behind in terms of true value. So you've got to make sure that those things happen, because everything can change, from insurance costs to just the cost of buying food. If fuel costs go up and you're doing the field services and you have vehicles driving around all day, you're going to be paying more than what your contract rates are paying you for. So you've got to be mindful of those things. A good contract, in my mind, has funding for spay-neuter. We've talked a lot about spay-neuter here. I'm sure we'll continue to talk about it through the rest of the week. But you've really got to try to incentivize anyone you're contracting with that if you're looking over the long term, if you're trying to actually do something different or make an improvement in what's going on today by contracting with us, then you have to do some investment. And you don't have to make them invest everything. Remember, as a nonprofit, part of your responsibility is to fundraise. And one of the great things you can fundraise around is spay and neuter. One of the great things you can get grants for is spay and neuter or desexing. So don't feel like the government has to pay for all of it, but you can meet them part way with that, and they should certainly invest in some of it. And you should be able to incentivize them to do that, that if they invest in some of those things, that maybe they get discounts on other things as other things change, like intake if it goes down. A common thing that I see that people forget or don't calculate for in a contract for animal services is the actual assets that are involved. You know, if you're running an animal shelter, that building's going to take a beating, right? The HVAC, the air conditioning might break at some point, right? If it gets old, it needs maintenance. You know, the building has to be taken care of. If you're doing the vehicles, they have to be taken care of. They have to be replaced occasionally. Those things have to be factored in over time to make sure that you're not eating the cost of those things by providing the services. And you can do that by, you know, establishing either a fund that you sort of set aside money into, or managing the assets individually, you know, if there's only a few to worry about. But you really got to think about those big ticket items because, you know, if you buy those industrial size washers and dryers, you're spending $15,000 when one of those things breaks down. Well, that's not exactly, you know, chump change in your pocket. It's real money, and it's probably something you haven't budgeted for. And so that last one there is, you know, I'm talking sort of more holistically about some of the things that you have to be aware of when you're doing your contracting, but what's coming in the shelter is important too. And the number of animals or cost per animal is a good starting point. And it's fine to serve the basis of a contract, but it should not be the only basis for a contract. Just as an aside, if you happen to be a government contracting to other governments, we do have limits on what we can charge. We can only charge the true value or the true cost. We're not allowed to make a profit off government. So that's a limit that I have. Nonprofits don't have that same limit, but again, as I said before, you want to charge a fair price. You don't want to gouge them just because you think you can. And so a lot of the things I just talked about, you can actually pull all into a percentage called overhead. And you can calculate, well, over time, here's what we basically spend on maintenance in a given year, or we spend on fuel or X, Y, Z, whatever it is, that you're going to put all in there together, and you calculate a percentage. In my city, particularly because our labor costs are very, very high in government, our overhead rate is 58%. So something I would charge, something that would cost me directly $100 actually costs me indirectly $158 because I have to pay for all the services that my department receives from the rest of the government. So for example, hiring people, right, HR things, or the lawyers that I mentioned. Well, I don't pay them directly through my budget. They're paid by the city and they're assigned to me, but there's a cost to that, right? There's a cost for all those extra services that I'm provided. Now, typically when you're a nonprofit agency, you're not doing that. You're not paying to a centralized piece. You're gonna pay for your own overhead, your own internal services like your HR functions, your legal functions, your payroll functions, all those things. But you got to make sure you're calculating whatever percent that the contract's going to take of that's being properly apportioned to the contract, so that that you're not missing a hidden cost. Another common area that folks will miss. So when aren't contracts a good idea? And there's a lot of reasons they aren't. Certainly, if taking on this say you're already operating an animal shelter and you already take in a certain number of animals a year, and you're going to take on this contract that's going to add, let's say, double or triple the number of animals you're going to take in. And it's great, we're going to have a bunch of money, we're going to be able to hire more people, so on and so forth. But now it's 5 dogs to a kennel, and cramming cats in, and you don't have enough time and space to manage them. Then you shouldn't have a contract. There's an agency in California, they have contracts with 50, that's 50, other cities. They take in about 70,000 animals a year. They have a euthanasia rate of about 50%. The cat euthanasia rate's over 70%. When you go into their shelter, it's 5-6 dogs per cage. They get in a lot of trouble with the public. There's just another expose on them recently showing crowded dogs in a cage with feces all over the place, completely filthy and dirty, you know, internal investigations, audits, lawsuits, everything. And it's because this crazy business model they have where they have 50 contracts for service. They don't need those contracts for service, but their business model is we need money to have these services, and they just want to be bigger and bigger and bigger. And unfortunately, what suffers? It's the animals. Who else suffers? The organization. I mean, they're taking it really bad in the press. They have a horrible reputation. And unfortunately, they're not willing to change their business model because it brings in so much money and revenue. And in fact, it always surprises me that the other cities that are contracting with them don't rethink their contracts with them because they have such a poor image and the quality of care is so bad. But here's the bottom line, and I'll talk about this again in a little bit. If you're the contracting agency, who's the one that's going to take the bad hit in the press? It's not going to be the government anymore. It's going to be you. If the results aren't good, it's going to be your fault, not their fault, your fault. And you have to keep that in mind because once you take that step into contracting, this is now yours. And they get to basically wipe their hands of it. So obviously, if a contract doesn't provide enough compensation, that's a problem. You've got to make sure that you're able to do this. We went through an audit, it's been about 3 or 4 years ago now. We audited all our contracts, and one of them we found we weren't charging enough, and we were fairly off by about, I think it was about 30%. And it had been an old contract for many years, and it was time for renewal anyway, so it provided the opportunity to change it. But because the contract was going to change by so much, I did phase it in for them. But there wasn't anything I was going to do to cut them a break. I said, well, look, you're going to have to pay for the services. It's just what it costs. And again, we weren't gouging them or anything. And a contract that doesn't incentivize positive outcomes is not a good contract. And we'll talk about that too. So really what you got to ask yourself as an organization is it make sense to rely on this contract? You want to be able to walk away if you have to. You want to be able to be independent coming to the table, not desperate and not dependent on getting that money. Otherwise, you're probably going to make a bad deal. So you've got to have your own confidence first. Obviously, you know, a lot, particularly in the nonprofit area, but a lot of agencies are helping other agencies, right? So a nonprofit's helping the government because they want to try to help the animals, right? They want to try to do a better job. Of course, they want to get some funding. But typically the reason you're getting involved is because you don't think what's happening is working very well, or there's a desperate need for it. For example, in the case where a local council doesn't have an animal shelter and you have the animal shelter. And by the way, in those circumstances, which I know do exist here in some cases, you're in a very powerful position. The government's not going to go out and build an animal shelter in most cases, right? It's too much of an expense to lay out there. So the fact that you have that asset is a very powerful negotiating tool. Bear that in mind. In most cases, you're really in control of this process. Unfortunately, in most cases, we don't come into the process being in control. And what we usually end up doing is subsidizing the services. This is a great example. Philadelphia, they've had their tough times over the years, but I'm happy to say they are definitely on the improvement. This is a city that's going to have a great comeback story when it comes to animal welfare. But it was a hard road getting there. And this is a wonderful example of back about 15 years ago, it was an SPCA that had always provided the sheltering services for the city. Philadelphia is not a small city. I think now it's around 2 million people in terms of size. So it's probably a little smaller than that 15 years ago, but it was not small. A lot of economic challenges, a lot of areas that aren't well funded. And this SPCA had been doing this work for many, many years, and the head of the agency, this guy by the last name of Hendricks, finally said, I'm done. You aren't paying me enough. We're subsidizing way too much. I love his quote. This was his quote in the newspaper. We don't have the resources to continue to subsidize animal control, nor do we have the desire to continue to simply process thousands of animals on their way to death. So they were being paid $790,000 a year. When he cut ties and forced the government to pay for their own services and tried to do it on their own, they paid almost $3 million to do what they were paying him $800,000 to do. And so he really forced the issue in a way. And it was not easy for his organization to do this. I mean, $800,000 is a lot of money to walk away from. But they weren't accomplishing their goals, right? Just simply processing thousands of animals on their way to death. And they were subsidizing simply processing thousands of animals on the way to death. They were paying to do this horrible work for themselves. So it really made no sense at all for the organization to do this. But that takes some courage. And my guess is there were some tough conversations with the board before they could make that decision because, again, you walk away from that kind of money, you're going to have to either find another way to do it or you're going to have to change the way the organization works, and those are both difficult things to do. And so, are there differences in the contract? Excuse me. There are. It's not, I think I mentioned yesterday, it's not as expensive to care for a cat as it is for a dog in general. Particularly if you're doing the field services, you're going to invest a lot more time and energy picking up dogs than you are picking up cats usually. So you have to look at those things separately, even though you're trying to sort of have an entire contract. You got to really know what you're getting into. This is back to the data thing. If they can't provide you the data of how many animals are going to start showing up, then how do you really know what you're negotiating about? And how do you really know how to prepare? And it's not so much even then about the money. At that point, it starts to become about the space. If you have the space for 2,000 animals and they start bringing in 5, well, what are you going to do with 5,000 animals? You weren't ready for that. You don't have a building for that. But you didn't know because going in, you didn't have the information, which is why I say you have to be very, very skeptical and probably not enter into agreements with a group that can't provide you some information, some basic information so that you know what's going on. And different communities value things differently. We have, there's some communities in California where they just don't do much about cats, unless those few categories I told you about, of course, injured, sick, bitten somebody, those kind of things. But outside of that, if it's a healthy, free-roaming cat, they're not going to go out and pick it up. They're not going to do anything about it. They won't even, in some cases, accept them into the shelter. They say, well, the best we can offer you is maybe a spay-neuter voucher or something like that to stop the cat from breeding, but we're not going to house cats. And I think I also mentioned yesterday, there's even a couple cities that I've found that have in their own law specific exclusions for cats that say the officers won't pick up, they'll pick up any animal except a cat. And that's mainly because they just don't want to pay to manage cats. I'm not saying that's good, I'm just saying understanding that going in is very important. And let's see. Revenues. So sometimes contracts are designed beyond just the basic price, right? So there's like a flat rate, but then you also say, well, okay, but we're going to do adoptions, so we'll keep the money from adoptions. That'll help offset some of the costs. So we can offer you a slightly lower rate because we're going to get money from adoptions. Or for every person who comes in and reclaims their pet, we're going to get money from them, so we're going to take that money. That can help offset. And so what I've seen is people will design these contracts with sort of these offsets so that the base value of the contract gets lower because you feel you can collect revenue to make up the difference. Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with that, I would say, except that you really have to know what you're getting involved in. So, for example, if you're not going to be able to do a lot of adoptions, then you're probably not going to make a lot of money out of adoptions. If you're not going to be able to return a lot of animals to their owners, then you're not going to be able to make a lot of money off return to owners. So you have to know what your capacity or your capabilities are going to be to make that money. If you're going to do a lot of euthanasia, which hopefully you're not going to get into a contract to do that, but this is very common. So that city that I was telling you about that has 50 contracts, well, they have a very low adoption rate as a percentage of intakes. So that revenue source and their return to owners is very low because they have very high euthanasia rates. So all those animals they euthanize, 50% of the animals, they don't get other lines of revenue from those animals. And so they're stuck with that cost. And unfortunately, what that incentivizes you to do is euthanize them, right? Because the faster you get them through the process and euthanize them, the less they cost your bottom line. And that's a really bad incentive to have. And again, the contracts aren't written that way, but meaning they don't say, well, the sooner you euthanize them, the better off you'll be. But when you structure them this way, that's basically the incentive you've created. whether inadvertently or on purpose, the incentive you've created is the faster you get the animals through and euthanized, which is the cheapest, easiest thing to do, the less this is going to cost you in the long run. And so you have to think about, when you're going in these contracts, what risks are you going to assume? Like I mentioned before, it's going to be you that's going to be talking to the media. It's going to be you that's going to get the microphone put in your face and the camera outside your front door saying something horrible is going on here. Because the people writing the check have absolved themselves of that responsibility. They've given it to you. And you got to make sure you're able to handle it and you're able to do things or improve things in such a way that that doesn't harm your organization. Again, as a nonprofit, you should be fundraising. If you're fundraising requires having a good relationship with your community. It requires having a good image. It requires people wanting to give you money because they think you're doing good things. If you're going to end up in the press looking horrible all the time, you're not going to be able to raise money to do the other things that you want to do. And enforcement of laws is an interesting one. I've seen this go both ways. So some agencies will actually use having, say, an inspector, we call them investigators, that inspect things for like cruelty and things like animal fighting and so on. They'll actually use that as a piece to fundraise on and say, look, help support this. You know, we save animals, we protect animals, we get the bad guys. But the day-to-day enforcement of just picking up dogs or writing people a ticket because, you know, the dog was loose or they didn't have it registered or whatever, it's hard to fundraise on those things. And you have to think about, do you want to be involved with sort of the day-to-day regulatory activity? There are many that don't. They'll just do the sheltering, maybe have a couple of private investigators just to look at cruelty and things like that, and they'll leave the day-to-day animal management or enforcement to the government. And they'll employ their own officers that bring stuff into you. And I know several of you have contracts like this. And partly it's because there's not a lot of traction to be gained there. And the downside is there is some ill will that you can get there, right? Because unfortunately, sometimes, for better or for worse, your enforcement officers have to do things like take animals away from people or not let them get their animals back or, you know, write them tickets or get them in a lot of trouble. You think those people are going to be a big fan of your organization after all that? No. So you have to think about those things when you're getting into contracts. If that's an area you want to be involved in or not, and if it's an area you think you can spend. There are plenty that do it, at least in America, that will do both pieces, and they do it successfully. They're still able to have a good relationship with the community, and I think Todd's talking later today about more community enforcement, and he talked about it earlier. That's a great way to take enforcement and turn it on its head and really show that you're supporting the community. And so if you feel like you can do those things in that way and really bring the community in to your mission and to what you're trying to do, then these are perfectly fine things to do. But if you're not, people are just going to go out there and be sort of heavy-handed and just start writing tickets to everybody, that's going to be tough for your mission. Again, with the overcrowding, if taking in a contract is going to cause poor housing and poor conditions, that will only backfire on you. And not to mention, not only will it backfire on you publicly, but it's not so great for your staff either. You know, the people that have to go in there and clean them every day or do a lot of euthanasia, you know, when organizations go through that, you tend to see a lot of turnover. People don't stick around very long because it's a tough environment to work in. So you really have to be clear about what you're getting yourself involved in, because your image is really paramount when you're a nonprofit. And if you're gonna go into this and harm yourself, it's probably not a wise idea to do a contract. So basically, when you're figuring out the cost, you want to sort of figure out that base cost based on what they want. Remember that question at the beginning: what do you want? What does this look like to you? What do you need us to provide for you? And then you go back and figure out that cost. Don't have a preconceived idea of what they want. Just let them tell you. I think it's one of the best ways to start a conversation when you're contemplating contracting with someone, is really have a good understanding of what they're interested in seeing taken care of. And then, of course, how much is that going to cost? But you want to avoid having too many variables. You know, I've talked about like revenue schemes and how you can have offsetting revenues or you can have incentives and things like that. You don't want to have too many different variables because I think it's really difficult to try to build them, right? Because then now every month you're trying to figure out 50 different, variables of, well, this many animals versus that many animals, this cost versus that cost. So try to keep it as simple as you can. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have variables in there or incentives in there, But at least when it comes to your base cost, try to keep it fairly straightforward, so it's not just doesn't make life difficult for yourself. And typically, you're not going to include paying for services like fundraising, right? If you're going to do development, and you're going to pay people to do development for you and go out in the community, or things like humane education, stuff like that, governments typically aren't going to pay for some of those softer things. So make sure that's in your business model, because the probability is you're not going to be able to fund those separately, which means you'll have to do that fundraising to fund those other things. This is very common. I see this with humane societies or SPCAs in America that contract services. They almost operate as a two-piece organization. One piece is all the government services we're responsible for providing and that we're paid for and that are offset by these payments, and everything else that we do. And everything else tends to be all the feel-good stuff, you know, the fundraising, the adoptions, the events, the marketing, the outreach, all those things. Now, that isn't to say that you can't try to build some of those expenses into your budget that you're forming with the government, but it gets difficult to fully fund those things. So make sure you're kind of thinking of those things in two different ways. If you're gonna take on government contracts as a nonprofit, you're almost operating in two houses. It doesn't mean your books have to be completely separate in the accounting, but you do have to sort of approach different programs differently, because the government's not gonna pay for everything you wanna do. Typically, they wanna get away with the least amount they can pay for, and that typically is what are they required to pay for? What do they have to do? So, paying for intake, a few examples. You can just sort of do the minimum hold plus euthanasia, which is sort of the cheapest way to do it. I would strongly advise you from taking on a contract that that's all it's going to do. If that's all they want you to do, you can say thanks, but no thanks. You can find somebody else to do that for you. Now, interestingly, if you as an animal welfare community in your area can all agree to that, you force the government into a situation where they have to pay more for the services. Because one thing we do see sometimes is one nonprofit may undercut another, right? Because they want to get the contract. Why? Because they want the money. And so all they're thinking about is getting a paycheck every month from the government that will help support services, and they're willing to take a lower cost to do that, and in fact subsidize those services in order to get it. Well, that sort of undermines the whole process that I'm talking about here. And so you guys have to sort of get on the same page if you're going to be competing. Now, thankfully, it doesn't happen a lot where there's competing organizations, because it's not a simple thing to take on an animal management contract, right? It takes a lot of effort, a lot of expense, especially if you're going to do enforcement, but certainly if you're running a shelter, there's a lot of animals, and you know, most nonprofits don't actually own an animal shelter. So typically, it's only the ones that have the actual asset. Every now and then, government will have the asset, meaning the animal shelter, and they'll pay you to come in and take it over and run it for them, which is fine, but that tends to be a more competitive environment then, because now you can have different agencies competing. One of the easiest ways to do it is a per animal or a flat rate, but if you're gonna do a per animal, if you're just doing animal sheltering, you gotta make sure that you build in all those costs I was talking about. So your per animal cost, you know, isn't $100, it's $200 or whatever it is. But you've really got to figure out first, what is this really going to cost me? And understand that year to year, that number will never, ever be the same. So understand that some years, if you're going to take in 300 or 400 fewer animals or 300 or 400 more animals, the value of that contract's going to go up and down. So it's a little more volatile by the end of the year. So be prepared for that. You either have to budget for that, or you have to prepare the government for that, knowing that, hey, even though this year you budgeted $100,000, we took in 300 more animals, so you're actually going to have to pay us $120,000. Well, they're not going to be too excited about that, because they weren't planning for that. And their budget was already set long ago. Per animal per day is an interesting one. You know, it would involve calculating length of stay. I've seen some people try to do this. This is very tricky because it's a lot of math. And it's subject to some criticism, because if you send the bill, you know, at the end of the month, and they start realizing, geez, they've had that dog for 5 months, and I'm getting charged a per day fee for this animal. I've spent $3,000 for this dog they're sitting on. But it subjects you to some scrutiny. So I would avoid that, except in cases where you're forced to hold on to them. So a good example would be, say there's an investigation going on, cruelty investigation. So the dog's been impounded. It's there in the shelter. You can't really do anything with the dog until the case gets settled, so you're stuck with it. And it's just going to live with you. Excuse me. It's just going to live with you for a few months. Well, you should have in your contract things that deal with that, right? Things that say, okay, if you're going to do an investigation, you stick a dog here with us for however long it takes you to do an investigation. There's a charge per day you're going to pay us to do that, because we're not going to sit on this dog indefinitely and eat the cost. But in fairness, if you're gonna hold every animal until you find a home, and that means several animals or even hundreds of animals are going to be there for many, many months, you have to balance that philosophy that you have with what the government's going to want to say, which is, well, we only feel responsible to a certain point. And so that's where the incentives can come in. And then certainly in field services, there's a variety of ways you can do it. You can apportion it. So, you know, for example, if they're the only one you're providing services to, then it's pretty straightforward. Whatever your cost is for doing business is what your cost is. But if you have multiple contracts, and say you run 2,000 calls a year, and for one city it's 1,500 calls, and the other city it's 500 calls, well, you apportion it correctly. One city's going to be paying 75% of your costs, and the other's going to be paying 25% of the cost, because that's just what's fair. I've also seen just an hourly rate. So you go and you figure out with your overhead sort of an hourly labor rate that includes things like fuel and replacement and things like that, insurance and all those things. But say you come up with an hourly rate, it's, I don't know, $100 an hour to provide field services. So all you then do is track how many hours a day we spend going out and responding to calls on your behalf, and we're going to charge you against that hourly rate. Sort of like a lawyer would do, or an accountant, or things like that, where you're just charging an hourly rate. But again, you've got to make sure you have all your costs involved in that calculation. So paying for outcomes. This is a little trickier, but it can be done. And it's not completely exclusive from intake. But for example, these are incentives that you might think about putting in a contract. If they invest in TNR, maybe it gives them a discount somewhere else, particularly if it reduces intake. So if through TNR or SNR or any other kind of activity we can reduce euthanasia or reduce intake, then we'll charge you less because of that. Because you're investing over here, you're saving money over there, right? And so you can try to build those incentives into your contract and say, well, our target is, you know, a 75% save rate this year, and next year it'll be, you know, 80% or whatever. And as you reach those goals, and I'll show you an example, you can incentivize the better your job you do, the more they pay you for a better job. Let's see, all those I think I talked about. So here's just a quick, easy mathematical example. It's not really real life. I just did it for easy math. So say you have a contract for 1,000 animals a year. Basically $85 an animal is the cost. So your base contract would be $85,000. And then you say, for every positive outcome, you're going to give me $50 more. For every animal I can save and improve upon, you're going to give me an incentive. So at 50%, your contract would already be $25,000 more. And that's 50%, frankly, is a very easy target to hit. Just basically doing nothing, you can almost get to 50%. And that's pretty common, sadly, in our industry, 50%. But I used to use it as a starting point. So let's say you improve that to 75%. Well, now you've just increased your cost. You're almost bringing in 50% more in revenue than you were to start with, because you've incentivized the contract to get you to get up there. Now, I would say once you start getting above 75%, and I can just speak to this from experience, but others can as well, the cost to help animals, the further up the percentage you go, is more and more and more. And you don't want to forget that in an incentive program. You don't want to still think that a little bit extra is going to help those ones that have a lot of really bad problems. Because once you start getting up over to 75 and 80%, what's left is time-consuming, difficult, expensive surgeries and rehabilitation. They're going to be with you for a long time, or in foster, or whatever. So you should try to figure, okay, I get more incentive once I get past a certain amount. Again, trying to build incentives in your contract that also help fund the services you're going to be providing for those animals is an important way to go. And you can see here, you get to 85% in this kind of an example, you've really increased your revenues quite a bit. And so you can scale that up, because obviously it costs more than $85 for an animal to care for it. So when you negotiate, if you've never had a contract with them before, then it's sort of an all-at-once prospect. You're going to sit down, you're going to talk about terms, you're going to go back, you're going to crunch numbers, you're going to go back and forth. What services do you want? What services don't you want? You're going to decide whether or not it's a contract you want to be in. if you're already in a contract with somebody and you go back and you look at it and you go, you know, we're really being underpaid here, you may want to do it in steps like I did, because it can be some sticker shock. I mean, if you came back, you've had a contract with somebody for the last decade, and now you go, you know what, we're going to need 50% more because we've figured out we're really subsidizing your services. Well, they're going to go, whoa, wait a minute, 50% more, that's a whole lot of money. So understand they didn't get there by themselves. You know, you were a partner in these contracts. Nobody held a gun to your head and made you sign those contracts. You agreed to do those things. So understand that there's an impact to them. And in fact, in the case where I told you we got audited, they actually went out and did a solicitation of other animal control agencies to see, okay, well, you guys are increasing the cost for us. Let's see if we can get it from anybody else for cheaper. And nobody else could provide it cheaper. We just had a bad formula in one of our contracts that had left us short. And so getting even was a fair thing for us to do, to get back to even, but we understood the impact to them, so we phased it in over a period of 3 years, you know, taking a chunk each year, and they found that to be a fair way to do it. And now, since then, going forward, it automatically adjusts each year. It's not a flat contract in every year. Of course, you want to talk about the investments in the incentives like I talked about. Connecting the fees to the results is important. To the degree you can, you know, keep it simple. Understand, you know, you don't have to do this. So you as an organization, when you're going into these things, you really have to go in with your eyes open. Know who you are going in. Know what your values are going in. Understand your mission, understand the law, understand what's happening. Because the things that you're going to risk potentially, if this doesn't work out well for you, are significant. It's the trust of the community. It's the future of your organization. It's not just about getting some extra money, you know, in the bank to do operations. You can't sacrifice those things. And I know that can sound difficult because you look at, say, what the local council is doing, and they're doing a horrible job, or at least as far as you can tell, assuming you can even get the numbers about it. And you really want to do something to help them. But sometimes entering into a contract isn't the best way to help. Maybe the best way to help is staying independent of them and doing your own fundraising and developing other programs that will help. It may not necessarily mean entering into a contract. So just taking over that big mess isn't always the best idea. So you really have to be thinking about this when you get involved. It's okay to get involved, but just make sure you do it with your eyes wide open. And as long as you know those things about yourself, you're the one that's going to remain in control, and you're the one that's going to be leveraged in the best position to get the best deal for your organization that can then help the community and help animals to have better outcomes in your community. So that's it. Thank you.